We'll give folks just 1 minute to jump on, and then we'll get started. Okay, we want to welcome everyone to the Optional Practical Training Information session. This evening, we're really excited to be talking with you. We know that this is always an exciting time for you because you are getting ready to finish your program at the university and getting ready to consider the next part of your journey after graduation. And OPT, Optional Practical Training, is really very much a part of that journey. So really glad to be here to give you the information that you're going to need to participate in OPT successfully, to submit the application. We have a number of topics that we'll cover tonight, from remote work options to travel while you're at OPT, to what are your responsibilities. We're going to throw a lot of information at you. Most of the students who RSVP'd for this evening are graduate students and professional students. So we're going to have a few extra notes for you, but if you're an undergrad, all of this is still going to apply and will be important for you to review. So very excited you're here. Logistically, if you have a question, we'll probably answer it while we are in the middle of the presentation, but you can put that in the Q&A section, and we will either answer that in the Q&A box or here live in the presentation as we see them come up. So where do we start? There are a few questions that we will definitely cover in the next hour. And hopefully the first portion of the conversation, the first 30 minutes, will be the presentation. We'll leave extra time at the end for more questions, for more detailed questions. But what we look to cover at the end of this conversation, you should feel comfortable with. Questions like, what is my status while I'm on OPT? And this comes up frequently for students. What will I be if I need a new visa? What do I apply for? And it's important to remember that OPT is a benefit of your F1 status. So you are still in F1 status while you're on OPT. If you have to leave, go home, apply for a new visa, it's going to be an F1 visa that you're applying for. So while on OPT, you are still an F1 student on OPT. Another question that we will tackle in the next few minutes, and that is frequently asked, is what is my expected timeline? How do I know when to do things? What's the best timeline? What do I need to consider? Do you have a job? Maybe that's impacting the questions that you're asking about your timeline. And so we'll review that, and we'll look at your I-20, figure out how is that going to establish some of your timeline while you prepare for OPT. A third question that isn't asked in this exact way, but a version of it is asked of us in the office, and that is, what does it mean to be authorized for work? And what does it mean that I'm authorized or not authorized? Because at this point, USCIS is going to authorize you for OPT. For 12 months, you are authorized to work within your major. But what does that mean? And we'll talk about those different details. And then finally, what are my responsibilities while in OPT? What are your responsibilities? And how will those be different from when you were a student, enrolled, and now that you've graduated? And I just realized as I get ready to introduce my colleague that I didn't introduce myself. Most of you may know that my name is Leah. I'm the director of the International Student and Scholar Affairs Office. And I'm pleased to introduce my colleague, Cynthia Reeves, the assistant director in our office, to review the next portion of our presentation.
Thank you, Leah. All right, so we're just going to start off and talk about what OPT actually is. So OPT, it is a benefit of your current F1 status, and this is the work authorization that you're allowed after graduation. OPT For any work that you do on OPT, it must be directly related to your program of study, your major, not your minor. So your major program of study is what your OPT is based upon. To be eligible for OPT, you must be enrolled on your current CBIS ID for 1 full academic year, and you're eligible for OPT once at each academic level. So if you're a master's student now, you complete OPT and then you come back to Notre Dame or another higher institution for a PhD, you're eligible for OPT again. When you're eligible for OPT after your program completion date. So there's a time frame of when you'll want to apply. We recommend everyone apply as early as possible. The earliest you can apply would be 90 days before your program end date, and as late as 60 days after your program end date. But we want everyone to apply as early as possible, and we'll get into more of that future slides. Okay. The very first or the most important thing we want everyone to realize is that you do not need a job offer to apply for OPT. If you have a job, that's great. If you don't have a job, that's still totally fine. Still make sure that you're going ahead to apply, even if you do not have a job. And your employment authorization for OPT when you apply must start within 60 days of your program end date. So basically that means it must start before your grace period ends after graduation. OPT is what we're talking about here now. It's limited to 12 months. Some individuals, if you are in a STEM field, you're eligible for the OPT STEM extension, which will give you additional 2 years. But right now, we're just going to focus on the post-completion OPT, which is 12 months for everyone. USCIS is the organization that will grant you authorization for OPT. Our office will be the one to help you submit the recommendation, but we are not the ones that will give you the authorization to do the work. One important thing to know is that last year in 2020, the averaging processing time was anywhere between 2 to 5 months for students to receive their authorization. Even though it was taking longer for USCIS to approve your applications, you still cannot apply more than 90 days before your program end date. So we'll look into this a little bit further, but how soon you can apply depends on what your end date is on your I-20. And also at the current moment, when you're applying for OPT, the filing fee for this is $410 currently. So now we're just going to talk about the different types of employment that's eligible for an OPT. So once you're on OPT, any work that you do must be related to your degree of study. And so this work can be regular paid employment. It can be unpaid employment. You can be self-employed. It can be a volunteer position. It can be through an employment agency. You can be an independent contractor. And you must work at least 20 hours a week, which is considered full-time for your OPT. One thing that we do want to touch on is right now, current policies are allowing for remote work to be done while on OPT. So say you're working back in your home country, US company, while you're on OPT, that is totally fine. You just want to make sure that you report the employment. And when you report the employment, you want to report the company's US address, but then there'll be a place in the box where you can indicate that what your remote work site is. Excuse me. Please.
Okay, I think this is me again.
Yes.
Yeah, so we want to talk a little bit about the I-20 program end date, because this is going to set your timeline. We're going to start talking about the timeline for applying, for choosing authorization date. Because the university did change the semester dates due to the global health crisis, your program end date may not match what the current graduation day is for May 2021. It may not match the end of finals, which is the two typical dates we'll see students choose as the program end date. And so we'll talk about what you might need to do for that. It's important to remember, especially for our graduate students who have a thesis or a dissertation, that the US government is much more concerned with the date that your degree requirements are fulfilled than the administrative graduation date. So if you are defending your dissertation in 3 weeks, then you're going to need to rethink your program end date. That can't necessarily be May of 2021. If you're graduating in, defending in April, then we might want to have a conversation about moving your program end date up. This can be a real advantage to you if you are looking to finish early because you have an opportunity you want to take advantage of, but it also may complicate your planning. So think about that. Your defense dissertation, your thesis dissertation, your dissertation defense, your thesis defense may establish your program end date a little bit differently than the administrative graduation date on the university calendar, because of the US government's expectation that once you fulfilled your degree requirements, your program is complete, your F1 program is complete. So if you're an undergraduate, you can choose one of two dates as your program end date. You could leave it as the May 16th, that's probably what it is right now, or you could choose the last day of finals, or you can choose your graduation date. No program end date can be beyond the graduation date of your graduating term. So for our undergrads on the call, those may be the two dates that you could choose. For our graduate students who do not have a thesis or a dissertation requirement as a part of their degree, this could be business, maybe law, then your last day of finals or graduation date is also going to be the same. That's your program end date. For our graduate students who have a thesis or dissertation, again, we'll say it a couple of times, but I'll say it again, that really it's much more important, when is your defense date? Typically, you've got your defense, you need more time to do edits, to resubmit the final draft. Those days may be more significant when you're choosing your program end date than that administrative graduation date. This will be vary across our graduate students who have a thesis or dissertation. So you can feel free to make an appointment with us and talk through that more, but just be aware of that. In some cases, that's going to line up with the graduation date. If you are doing it the last possible date that you are eligible to defend here for the spring semester, then you could keep that graduation date as your program end date. That's an important note. So I-20 program end date, if you have your I-20 with you right now, you can take a look at it. What is the date that's currently there? Does that need to be adjusted? And we'll talk about next week at our I-765 application review session about how to indicate what you want your program dates to be. One of the things that's important to consider with the program end date is travel while on OPT and that relationship. So for the time that you have been a student at the university, you have been entering the US in F1 status, there's always been some risk associated with travel, because when you exit the US and you come to re-enter, it's up to that Customs and Border Protection officer to consider whether they will grant you entry back to the US. So there's always a degree of risk. And what we found, of course, with the last year is that the US government could impose restrictions that make a travel that much more complicated. So there's always some risk with travel. While you're on OPT and you have your EAD card, you've been authorized for OPT, you've been approved, the risk of travel is similar to when you're an enrolled student. And so once you get the card later this summer, you'll be able to travel with the same level of comfort that you've traveled as you've been a student, okay? There is a period though, that there's a much higher risk of travel. And that is where we really want you to consider your travel plans even now, because it's gonna be a few months in the future, but you really wanna think about, is it worth the risk to travel? And that is after your program end date, whatever that is on your Form I-20, and before you receive your EAD card. Because in that middle ground, USCIS is still making a decision about whether they're going to approve your application and issue the EAD card. And if they don't approve it and you are not in the US, then you do not have a status to return to. And if you're not in the US, you can't come back and make the corrections to the application, because if they deny it, they deny it. And you want to make sure that you're here and ready to make the corrections and resubmit your application. So that period between after your program end date and before you receive that EAD card. It's a really high risk time to travel. We just had a student who submitted an OPT application a couple of weeks ago, and last week she received her application back from USCIS. It had been rejected because she had forgotten to sign a credit card form within the packet. If she had been outside of the US, her program end date had passed. She was a January graduate. Her program end date had passed. If they had rejected her packet and sent it back to her and she was outside the US, she could not return to the US and apply for OPT again. She just would have lost the OPT benefit. In her case, she was still in the US. She was waiting. She's waiting for her OPT application to be approved. So she's fine. She's still within her grace period. She's going to resubmit that application with a signed check form. And she's gone through the application again. She's checked with our office to make sure that she can use the same I-20 recommendation, and she'll be fine. She'll submit it again to USCIS. So travel and OPT, similar risk, except for this one window when you're waiting for your approval notice and your EAD card from USCIS. So that may impact how you're planning your travels now. Your F1 visa expiration date may be affecting your travel plans now. And the global health crisis may be affecting your travel plans and you are not planning on leaving at all. And that's all fine. We just want to make sure you understand that there's this heightened period of risk. So we want to talk about the OPT timeline. And so we started with the program end date on your I-20. And that's going to set the rest of your timeline, both for when you submit your application and when you set your authorization start date. So the OPT timeline, whatever is on your program I-20 now, or when you submit the OPT application and you say, this is when I want my program end date to be, you can submit your application up to 90 days before that program end date. So if your program end date remains May 16th, and it can, if you would like to keep it there, you just don't want to mess with the change, that's fine. But if you choose keep that date, February 17th is the first possible day that USCIS can receive your application. If you send it one day early, they will reject your application. You'll have to resubmit it. In some cases, they might cash the check and then reject the application. But if that arrives on February 16th, you've applied too early, they will reject it. There's no grace, no room there for error. They recently moved the lockbox location to Chicago. So we would recommend all of you submit that I-765 application packet the first day you're eligible to submit it, not the day before. Because if you mail that package out on the 16th, it's going to Chicago. They register it as having arrived on the 16th. And you're like, I paid for one day shipping. I did not want it to get there until the 17th, that it gets there the 16th. They'll reject your packet. You don't want to see that happen. So you're going to submit that February 17th. And Cynthia said this a couple times. We want you to submit the application as early as possible. There is no benefit to waiting. However, you are eligible to submit that application from February 17th all the way through, in this case, July 15th, because you can submit your application up to 60 days after your program end date, as long as you have remained in the US. After your program end date, once you exit the US, without having submitted that application, without having that receipt notice, the US government considers that you've abandoned your status and you're finished. If you remain in the US, you can submit your OPT application up until July 15th. This is important, especially if you're waiting on a grad school application to be reviewed and to get accepted to a different grad program, then you might want to wait until March to submit your OPT application. That's fine. Just be aware that's going to set everything else back, and it's going to arrive later. So the dates here are also significant because they are related to when you will set your authorization start date. And your authorization start date is different than your employment start date. The authorization start date is where you are telling USCIS, and first you're telling our office, but you are telling USCIS, I want to be authorized to work from this day to this day. And whenever you set that start date, that's going to establish the 12 months of authorization you have after. So if you have a job offer and that job offer begins on July 1st, then you might set July 1st as your authorization start date. right? You might set June 1st as your authorization start date because you want some flexibility to maybe work with your professor on campus to continue working in the lab over the summer before your job starts. So you could start and choose June 1st with the July 1st start date. It doesn't matter. Really, what you're communicating to USCIS is this is the period in which I want to be authorized to work. I want permission to work. And when you send that date to them, then that's the period. You cannot work before or after. So from here, for this student who's got a May 16th, 2021 program end date, they can choose a start date from May 17th to July 15th. They can submit that application on February 17th, but then they're setting that start date as May 17th to July 15th, any day within there. And there's different strategies for why you might choose a particular date, and we'll talk about that in a second. The other date on here is October 14th, 2021. And this is significant because in that 12 months of authorization, you are allowed 90 days of unemployment. And the US government is going to require that you report employment. But when you don't report employment, there's an unemployment clause on your record that just adds the days you are not employed. And you can have 90 days in this first 12 months of unemployment. So if you do not have a job, and the market is so difficult right now, if you don't have a job, then one strategy might be that you set July 15th as your authorization start date, because you just want to push off that, that situation, the job start date as far as possible. If you set July 15th and you are not finding a job, you're not finding a job, you have until October 14th of this year to find a job and report that employment to SCVP. If you want to have a little bit of flexibility, you don't have a job, but you really want to be able to tell an employer, I'm ready to work on June 1st, then you can set June 1st as that employment start date, and that authorization start date, that authorization start date, and then you have some flexibility. But June 1st is when your unemployment days begin to count. So that's really essential. This window in here, May 16th to July 15th, is the 60-day grace period that all F1 students have after their program. So you can just remain in the US this entire time. You have a legal status in the US, but it is important that you recognize you've got to get that application in. You're going to set the authorization start date here. Whenever you set it, that's going to set all of the other pieces. So a couple of examples to help think through, and one of these examples may be your situation or close to your situation. So we're gonna first talk about student Young. He has an employment offer. This employment offer start date is May 20th, so just a couple of days after his program end date, and his visa is valid through May 17th of this year. He does want to travel in the next year, so he's got to consider his travel plans as he's planning these different ventures. So for Young, we would say you have an employment offer. That's fantastic. May 20th is a very tight timeline. USCIS does not guarantee any of their processing times. And so even if he submits his application the very first day on February 17th, it is possible that his EAD card will not arrive in time for a May 20th start date. There's no way to expedite that. There's not a way for us to intervene to expedite. Sending a letter, calling USCIS is not going to expedite that process. So we're going to advise Young, you need to be in really close communication with your employer so that they understand that you've applied, but you are now just waiting on USCIS to approve. In terms of his visa and his travel, he's also going to want to consider if he exits, he has to get a new visa after May 17th in order to re-enter the US. And that could impact his work situation if he's still waiting on that employment. And if he wants to come back, he's got to apply for the visa. He has to wait for a visa appointment for them to process. There's a couple of things here to consider. But ultimately, he has a tight timeline. He needs to be in communication with his employer, and there isn't a way to expedite, but we would recommend that he apply as soon as possible to have the best chance of getting his card in time. Fatima also has an employment offer, but her start date isn't until September 1st. So she has lots more time to think about when she wants to set her employment authorization start date. So her job starts September 1st, but she wants to go home over the summer until August 15th. Her visa is valid until August 30th. So a couple of things. In her case, let's assume that May 16th is her program end date. In her case, we're going to recommend that she sets July 15th as her authorization start date, especially if she doesn't have any other employment. She really just wants to relax over the summer. She's been working so hard. We're going to say, probably recommend that you choose the last possible authorization start date, so that from July 15th to September 1st, she has 5 weeks of unemployment on her record, but that's the least amount of unemployment days. If Fatima thinks, actually, I'm going to try and work for my professor for a couple of hours a week, and he can guarantee me 20 hours for 2 weeks this summer, great. Then she's going to need to consider, when is that employment opportunity going to happen, so that she sets her start date to be able to participate. Because once she sets that authorization start date, she's going to have to report the employment. The unemployment clock begins, and she wants to be thinking strategically about that. And in this case, she is good to go home. Her visa is going to be valid through her return trip. There may be some risk associated, but we would still advise, maybe don't exit the US until you have your EAD card in hand. Ahan plans to return to his home country to work after graduation, has no plans to work in the US. And this is completely fine. He's not going to apply for OPT. What we would tell Ahan is to remember that if he does not apply for OPT before he leaves, and he doesn't get that authorization card, and he exits the US, he is no longer eligible for that OPT benefit once you've exited and you've passed your program end date. So if he calls us in September of this year and says, oh, I found a job in the US, I want to apply for OPT now, he's not eligible to do that. You have to apply for OPT within the window we just talked about, and you have to do so before you exit the US. So Ahan, great plan. Just remember, and we've had students do this where they've called us in October and August, so excited to come back and apply for OPT, and it is not an option for them any longer. They'll have to find a different way to come back to the States to work. Claire is our final student, and she's graduating this May as well. She does not have an offer, but she's looking. She does want to stay in the US. Her visa's expired, but she has no plans to travel. So she's in a good situation for remaining in the US. Totally fine. She can stay here through the grace period until her EAD card comes, until she finds a job through October 14th, assuming she chooses July 15th as the authorization start date. We would still recommend to Claire, submit your application before the end of February as soon as possible, so that you have as much flexibility. You're giving USCIS a long time to process your application. So these are just a couple of different student scenarios that we want to review. And I'm going to move on to specifically talk about authorization start date. I mentioned some of these points earlier. So just a reminder, it's not going to necessarily be the same as your employment start date. It may require you to use some of your unemployment days, particularly for those of you who may be doing the 5+1 program. If you are not authorized to work, or if your employment start date isn't until August 1st, and the last date that you can choose for authorization is July 15th, you will accrue 2 weeks of unemployment unless you find another position of 20+ hours a week that you can report. But that's going to be important to just be strategic about those unemployment days. They're a great tool if you need them based on your position. While you're choosing this authorization start date, you want to be really thinking about, am I going to want to have a flexible start date? Do I want to be able to say yes to any opportunity that comes up? Is my professor talking to me about helping with research, working in the lab? You have to be authorized to do that with the EAD card once your program end date has passed. You are no longer a student. You cannot work in the lab as a student without the authorization card once that program end date has passed. For those of you who have a dissertation or thesis, you want to think about this too. If you're shortening your program, that's the day that you can no longer work in the lab as a student, as a teaching assistant, until the EAD card comes. And because of the delays, there will likely be a gap there. You want to consider flexibility. You have the authorization for the year, and this is where you are authorized by the government to work. You have permission to work, but you must report every employment opportunity that exceeds 20 hours a week. You have to report that. If you don't report it, you're accruing unemployment, And that's one of your responsibilities. And then finally, the date that you set for that authorization, you will tell ISSA. ISSA will issue an I-20 with OPT recommendation. We'll send that to you back with information about how to improve your application packet. And at that point, you can change the date, the authorization start date. Once you have sent it to USCIS, the date is pretty much final. There's a small window in which you might be able to update it, but for the most part, as soon as you mail your packet off, you need to consider that final. That date is not going to be changed. I'm going to turn it over to Cynthia to talk about the EAD card.
There we go. We did have someone earlier ask what an EAD card is. The EAD card is basically your employment authorization document. This is the card that you're going to receive once your OPT has been approved. The main thing to know about this card is that you cannot begin your employment until you have this card in hand and the date has been reached. So once you get the card, it's basically the size of a credit card or your student ID. It's going to have your picture on it. It's going to have your country of birth, your birth date, your work authorization start and end date. So once you receive this document, you want to make sure that everything on here is correct. If the information on this document is not correct, you want to make sure that you reach out to us for instructions on how to get this document updated so you can begin your work processing. There is a online tracking process that you can go through. So I will let you know, before you get your EAD card, there's a few documents you can get in the mail. So when you first mail off your OPT packet, you'll get within 4 to 5 weeks, you'll get what's called an OPT receipt. That receipt is basically just proof that they have your application. Everyone will receive that document. The second document that you can get that not everyone receives, it depends on who's ever adjudicating your application. This is called an approval notice, and that just lets you know that your OPT has been approved. And then the third thing, which everyone will receive, is the EAD card, which is showing here, that lets you know that your work is begun. One thing that you want to make sure that you pay attention to is if you're tracking your status online, sometimes it could say approved, it could say sent for processing, and the card is being mailed. So if it just says approved, that means your OPT has been approved. If you log in and it says sent for processing, that means they're in the process of generating your EAD card, which you'll receive in the mail. And sometimes it can take between 4 to 6 weeks from when the time that it says approved to the time you actually get your card in the mail. And again, we want to reiterate that you cannot begin working until you have the card in hand and the date has been reached. And what I mean by date has been reached, so if you say you wanted your OPT to begin on July 15th, but then you get your card on July 7th, even though you have the card in hand, it's not July 15th. So you'll have to wait until that day to begin working. Slide, please. So your reporting responsibilities. So even though you will have graduated from Notre Dame and are out in the working world, you will still have reporting responsibilities to us. So just like as when you were a student, you have 10 days to report all changes to us. So those changes will be if you move, if you start a new job, if you lose your position, changes, we need to report those within 10 days. One thing that you want to pay really close attention to is if you have a job, as soon as you know that you have that job, you can report it within 10 days. We cannot backdate any employment. So say you have a job beginning on July 1st, and then we get to September and you realize you didn't report your employment. You're going to have to use unemployment days, and it's going to look like you weren't employed for that length of time when you actually were. So you're going to have to use unemployment days. We can't backdate it to show that you began working because the information was not reported. So you want to make sure that you're staying on top and reporting all the information in a timely manner. One thing to note is that After you graduate, you will still have access to ISSALink to report some changes. But once your OPT is approved, you're going to get an email about a SEVP portal, which is basically the student report system. So once you're approved, you'll get an email. The one thing about this email is they'll send you a link to set up this student reporting portal. That link is only valid for 2 weeks. So as soon as you get that link, you want to make sure you log in and set up your account. If you have problems setting up your portal, or you did not receive the email, or you're having problems with it, you want to contact us and we can help you get that situation straightened out. But as I said earlier, I want to reiterate, that link is only valid for 2 weeks once you get it. So as soon as you notice that your OPT has been approved, look for that email and set up that account. So we're just going to touch on the 24-month extension real quickly, this later. So the 24-month STEM extension, this is for students who are in a STEM field, as I mentioned earlier. So everyone gets the regular 12 months post-completion OPT. And then if you're a STEM student, you can apply for the 2-year extension. The one thing I recommend is that once you apply for post-completion OPT, the first 12 months, that entire packet that you get, make a copy of that entire packet and hold it until you're ready to apply for the STEM extension, because you're gonna have to do the exact same thing all over again, complete the same application, get the same documents together. And so if you have something right there, we can just transfer the information. That will be the best. You will also have to pay the $410 filing fee again. Someone asked me in the chat earlier what day they should put for their OPT STEM start date. So your STEM OPT always starts the next day after your current OPT ends. So once you have been on OPT and working for 9 months, and you want to make sure you put this on your calendars. So once you've been working on regular OPT for 9 months, that's when you want to start applying for the STEM OPT extension. So now currently with the regular OPT, you can apply 3 months before your program end date. For the STEM OPT extension, you can apply as early as 3 months before your current OPT ends. The one thing that you want to make sure of is that USCIS must receipt and receive your application before your current OPT ends. So if your current OPT ends on July 15th, they need to have your application before then. You have to have receipt. If they receive it on the 16th, 1 day later, it will be denied. So you want to make sure you that accordingly. The difference between OPT and STEM OPT is, so for regular OPT, you do not have to have a job offer to apply, and the position can be paid, unpaid, volunteer. For STEM OPT, you must have a job to apply, and it must be a paid position. And then for the the STEM OPT position that you have, the employer must be a part of the E-Verify system. And that's something that you would have to find out if they're E-Verified through that employer and their HR department. We wouldn't have that answer for you. Slide, please.
Okay, we're going to the overview next. I'll just note here, we typically talk just a little bit about the H-1B lottery process. And that is something that has recently been changing even in the last 2 weeks. So we actually took the slide off. Our office does not advise on the H-1B process, but we do want you to know that if you're going to participate in that with an employer, and the employer has to initiate that, if you were going to do that, you can apply for OPT and H-1B at the same time. And in 2 circumstances, that will be really beneficial. The first is if you are not selected in the lottery and you do not get the H-1B lottery position, then you want to have that OPT so that you still have an opportunity to work after graduation. So that's one benefit, is if you're submitting them both, you're absolutely able to do that. But it really just does secure your ability to work after graduation, especially in these first 12 months. The second benefit is that the H-1B start date is actually October 1st. And so if you want to be able to work before then, either for that employer or take advantage of another opportunity, again, We hear mostly students who want to continue working with their advising professors or their PI or continue to do research over the summer. You have to have authorization for that after your program end date. And OPT allows you to do that. You have to have that authorization card though. It allows you to fill the gap between your program end date and that H-1B start date if you go ahead and apply for OPT right now. So we won't advise on that, but we can tell you if you're in that, you have that opportunity, you can always apply for both opportunities. And we strongly recommend that. We had a couple of students last year who actually were not approved for H-1B in time, but they had OPT so they could keep working. Another student, there was a mix-up by USCIS and SEVIS in their system. It canceled his record, and he was able to continue to work simply because he had the OPT authorization, even though there was trouble with his H-1B application. And other students just want to ensure that they can work for the employer, whether that H-1B lottery comes through or not. So just a general overview, and then we'll move to questions pretty quickly. We'll do a few overview slides here. The first thing that you want to do is just review your responsibilities while you're on OPT. Since you had talked about your reporting responsibilities, you want to be aware that this is your application, your petition. Understand what you're submitting and where it's going and what that process is. In ISSALink, we have a OPT application form. This initiates the request to get an I-20 with OPT recommendation. When you submit that, an email is going to go to your academic advisor or your PI, and they're going to sign off to say, yes, the student is expected to graduate this May. Once you've done that, you are going to work on submitting the Submit OPT I-765 application draft form, also in ISSALink. And here you're going to gather all of your I-765 application documents. You're going to fill out the I-765 and submit that to our office for review. Once we have both of those forms, we will review your application packet. We will email you with information about corrections you should make or some recommendations for the application. Maybe you're missing a signature, you're missing an entry on one of the lines. We'll provide that information and send that back to you. You want to review that, make the updates, and it is optional. Some students really do want to sit down with us and talk through the application, and you're just nervous. You want to make sure it's right. You can schedule an appointment with us. If after you've received our corrections, you feel comfortable making those and submitting it to USCIS, you can do that. That's fine. We're flexible. But at that point, you are going to be mailing off your application to USCIS, and we'll give you instructions for where to send it, when to send it, any other notes. You are going to be tracking the application status, which means when the receipt notice comes, 3 to 5 weeks after you submit. When the approval notice comes and the EAD card comes, you're going to be tracking that. And then you're going to be responsible to maintain status while in OPT. We send reminders throughout your first 12 months of OPT to let you know, have you reported your employment? Please do so. If you don't, you've got unemployment on your record. You're going to report your employment and address changes through the SAVP portal. You're doing that. You can always reach out to our office for assistance, and if you need support or have questions, that it is your responsibility. Your academic advisor is recommending OPT, but really what they're doing is confirming that you are going to be graduating, which means you would be eligible for OPT. And then our office is just verifying your eligibility. We're going to recommend OPT and SEVIS. We're going to issue that new I-20 with OPT recommendation. And then we're going to send that back to you with corrections after we've done a courtesy review of your I-765 application. So a few takeaways, just remember you are driving this process. You want to be communicating, you want to be tracking. Once you've submitted your application, it really is a waiting game. You're waiting on USCIS to get back to you, to approve, to deny, to send you a request for more evidence. But you're going to be tracking that. We are not tracking that in our office. If you have questions about it, always feel free to reach out to us. You want to be really clear on what your expected timeline is going to be for the OPT process. And especially just remembering that USCIS does not guarantee processing time. So it's going to be a little bit uncertain. We've had lots of practices for that in the last year. Ultimately, they're going to be making that decision and setting their timelines, which may impact yours. Finally, you do not need a job offer. This is authorization to work. It is not authorization like CPT to work a particular job. The first 12 months is just authorization to work. And then we recommend that you apply for that if you have any interest as soon as possible. And just remain flexible. It's going to be a lot of scramble to get the documents together, to get your packets, to get it mailed off. It'll be a little bit stressful, but usually students come to us and say that was not as hard as I thought it was going to be. And then you send it off and you wait. And you just have to be flexible, open, recognize you don't have a lot of control in the process once you've mailed it off, okay? So just know that those are important things. I think it looks like Cynthia is answering the questions in the chat. So if you have any questions, we'll talk about next steps now. If you have any final questions, go ahead and put them in the Q&A and we can tackle them. You all should be able to see the answered questions in Q&A box. So next steps. First of all, we are going to recommend that you complete the OPT application form in ISSALink once you know what you want your authorization start date to be. You do have to enter it in that form. So if you want May 17th, if you know you're going to just keep that May 23rd graduation date, then keep that May 23rd graduation date. If you know that you want to shorten it to May 19th, or you know you're defending your dissertation earlier, then that's going to establish when you set your authorization start date. The second thing we want to strongly recommend that everyone does is to RSVP for our OPT I-765 authorization application, review session for next week. We know it's the first day of classes, but it is really essential in thinking out this timeline of what did you really need to fill out? What are the important notes? What are the mistakes that students commonly make when they submit this? And we'll show you a couple of sample packets so you have an idea of what your packet might look like. Again, it's not required. We will record it. We'll post it on our website, but it will be a really helpful tool to help you in completing that form. After that, we're going to recommend that you complete the Form I-765. You gather all those application documents, including the filing fee and your photos. So we'll have instructions about that. And then you're going to submit one PDF up into ISSALink for that draft that we can then review, give you feedback, issue your Form I-20 with the OPT recommendation. So those are your next steps at this point. I'm not sure which one Cynthia is responding to, but someone asked about resources for the filing fee. This is a great question because there really are not resources on campus to help with that filing fee. Most of the resources on campus are for when you're enrolled as a student, and then after graduation, they are not there. So you could certainly speak with the graduate school and reach out to them if you're in the graduate school. But typically, this is a fee you are going to have to find the funding for it yourself, either through work, an on-campus job this spring, something like that. You'll need to do that. A student has asked, are there any other OPT associated fees besides the application filing? And there are not. There are and there are not. Once you submit that fee, you are going to have to pay for your photos, which are typically $12 at CVS, and you'll have to pay for shipping of your packets to USCIS, either FedEx, UPS, or USPS. But once you've submitted that OPT application form, that's the only fee associated with it at that time. And then someone has asked, at which point can we update the program end date after submitting an ISSALink? You can update that right up into the point where you mail it off. If you get it back and you have the I-20 in front of you, you can always make an appointment with us and say, I actually need to change this. We will cancel that OPT recommendation and we will reissue with a new OPT recommendation. There's no impact for you. The less paperwork you have to shuffle, the better, but there's not a negative impact if you change your date at that point. Once you've mailed off your packet, there's a window of maybe 2 weeks where you might be able to get it changed. But with the delays at USCIS right now, and with the delays with the US Post Office and FedEx and all of that, we would really strongly recommend you do not send that off until you're certain about what authorization start date you want. A student asked, what if I receive the EAD card later than the 90 unemployment days? And that hasn't happened if students apply for the OPT authorization early. Typically, if you're giving them a long time to process that, But if they issue that EAD card, sometimes they will push the start date on your card to the date that they issued it, to the date that they processed it. And so you will lose the time before, but you may not have that unemployment time. You will not gain any time on the other end. You have to be done with your OPT authorization 14 months after your program start date. So it's 12 months within that window of 14 months. USCIS will sometimes push out that start date. Other times they will put it as the last possible start date, and you will have unemployment and you'll have to depart. And so that's why we want to encourage you to apply as soon as possible. And depending on your job offer situation, set it out a little bit later. It can be stressful, but honestly, I think in 4 years that I've been at the university, I think we've only had one student that had that happen. For the most part, they were able to get the card in time to begin reporting employment. And are there any other questions? Any other questions? Someone asked, is the program end date change a quick process? Within our office, we'd ask that you give us 3 or 4 days. I mean, you can make an appointment. If you make an appointment with us and we're available, we can change it right then. Typically, it's a very quick fix in SEVIS. It might just be a matter of we are going to be doing 60 appointments a week to help students process their OPT for the next few weeks. And so that may be where the delay is. But once we're able to do it, it's very quick. So a student asked, what happens if I qualify for OPT or I'm approved for OPT, but in the process, I am admitted to a PhD program? Assuming that you've applied at a master's level, then you will lose whatever time you don't use once you've been authorized. If you're a bachelor student, same thing. A PhD student, it's unlikely you're going for a second PhD, but if that was the case, you only have that the authorization at each education level. So you would need to be careful about that. But if you're in a master's program, you use your OPT, you would just lose whatever remaining time you had. We would transfer your record to the new PhD program and your OPT would be done at that point. Let me know if that didn't answer your question, Monica. Cynthia, were there any other questions in the Q&A that you think might be good just to say out loud, or have we covered most of it?
We covered mostly all of them, yes.
Okay.
Oh, one more just popped in.
Okay, saying thank you.
Oh,
okay, well, we will, on that note, go ahead and close out today's session. We will send out an email by Friday with a link to where this session and last night's session are recorded and left with notes for the OPT process, and a reminder about what your next steps are. And we'll send out the PDF of the slides as well, so you can review those as you need to. But really wishing you all the best of luck as you wrap up in your final semester, your final few months, and hope you have a wonderful time in making this transition and are able to celebrate your final semester here. Please always reach out if you have any questions, and we're glad to be here and help. Somebody asked, my last question, I guess, is about the program end date on I-20 is May 15th, but finals end later. Then that you can make the last day of exams your program end date. And you'll indicate that in the OPT application form. So thanks so much, everybody. Have a wonderful night. We look forward to connecting with you soon about your OPT application.